I was at the annual company retreat for Crestline Marketing. It was held at a beautiful, fancy hotel in the mountains. I had been working extremely hard all year, and I felt confident about finally getting the promotion to department head. Late one evening, David, my boss and the vice president, called me up to the roof terrace. The air was cool, and the stars were bright, but I felt a sudden coldness deep inside. David had spent months making small, uncomfortable comments he called flirting or mentorship. Now he stopped pretending. He cornered me near the railing, holding a glass of expensive brandy. "Audrey," he said, his voice dropping low, "I'm ready to sign off on your promotion. But you know that big jobs come with big favors, right?" I felt sick. He didn't even try to hide the blatant offer. Intimacy in exchange for my career advancement. I told him no immediately and firmly. I said his behavior was completely wrong and unprofessional. His charming, confident facade shattered right there. His face turned cold and furious because I had refused his power. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper that carried a deep threat. "You'll regret this. I made you, and I can break you." The very next morning, the promise of regret came true. I was called into a sudden, urgent meeting. David was there, looking perfectly professional and calm, along with the head of human resources. David didn't look at me once. He presented a folder filled with completely fabricated evidence. He had created fake complaints, claiming that I was the one who had been making inappropriate advances toward him for months. He claimed I was harassing him because he had refused to promote me. The head of HR, a cold-faced woman, looked at me with cold judgment, completely believing David's lies. The meeting was quick and brutal. My voice shook as I tried to argue the truth, but they simply cut me off. I was officially fired for creating a hostile work environment and unprofessional misconduct. Security was called to escort me out of the building. The humiliation of cleaning out my desk while people watched was a painful weight. As I carried my box of belongings past his closed office, David stepped out into the hall just for a second. He gave me a small, cruel smile, a flash of pure malice, and quietly said, "I told you you'd regret it." I was jobless, humiliated, and filled with deep despair. Being fired was the first part of David's revenge, but the second part was much worse. David was a very powerful man with many connections in the city's marketing industry. He was well known and highly respected, and he was completely unforgiving. Every time I applied for a new job, the pattern was the same. I would get an interview, everything would seem great, and then the communication would suddenly stop. I was sure David was blacklisting me, making sure I couldn't find work anywhere. He had ruined my reputation. I fell into a deep, dark depression that felt like a thick, heavy blanket. I felt completely powerless and utterly defeated by one man's lie. The bills started piling up quickly, and my small savings account drained away to nothing. I couldn't see any way out of the darkness. Facing the very real possibility of eviction, I knew I had run out of time and money. I swallowed my pride and began packing my few remaining belongings into boxes to move back in with my mother, believing my entire professional career was truly over. Moving back to my childhood home was hard, but my mother was a loving comfort. She saw how sad I was, and she tried to cheer me up by looking through old family photo albums. We sat together on the floor of the living room, flipping through pages of faded pictures from weddings and family gatherings long ago. It was comforting to remember happier times. Then we stopped on a page with a wedding photo from about 20 years ago. It was a large group shot of my mother's side of the family. My eyes suddenly fixed on one woman standing in the front row. She was beautiful with bright eyes and a familiar, quiet smile. I recognized her immediately. It was Sarah, David's wife, the woman I had seen standing next to him at the last company Christmas party. I froze, my stomach flipping over. I pointed a trembling finger at the woman in the photo. "Mom," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Who is that woman right there?" My mother barely glanced at the picture before answering, her tone completely casual, as if she were pointing out a house. "Oh, that's your second cousin, Sarah. We lost touch years ago after her father changed jobs and they moved west. Why do you ask, dear?" My mother's simple answer exploded in my mind, changing everything about my situation. Sarah, David's wife, my cousin. The man who had ruined my life, who had abused his power and lied to the entire company, was married to a woman who was family. David had no idea that I had this connection, this secret link to his personal life. All this time, he had been risking his entire marriage for a few moments of selfish power, completely blind to the fact that I was family to his wife. This wasn't a quick fix, but it gave me a strong, secret weapon. My depression vanished, replaced by a cold, strategic fire. I realized I didn't need to beg or ask for mercy. I didn't need to sue him in a normal court. I could orchestrate his complete and utter, spectacular downfall from the inside. I stood up from the floor, shaking off the dust of my old life and the sadness of my defeat. I looked at my mother, and my voice was suddenly strong and determined, the voice of a fighter. Mom, I need Sarah's full and complete contact information. Every phone number, every email address, every social media profile you can find. I need it now. I knew that exposing David to Sarah would be incredibly painful for her, so I couldn't just call her and dump the terrible news on her. I needed to be smart. I needed proof that was so solid, so complete, that she couldn't ignore it, and that David couldn't argue his way out of it. The problem before was that it was my word against his. This time, I needed the evidence to come from David's own mouth. I took the last of my savings, every penny I had left, and invested it all into high-quality, professional miniature recording equipment. I bought a tiny device that looked exactly like a harmless car key fob, but it could record hours of crystal-clear conversation. My first move was not about revenge. It was about building a powerful, undeniable legal case. I needed to trick David into feeling safe and arrogant enough to brag about his cruel victory. A small, plain box arrived 2 days later. I opened it and carefully held the tiny, cold piece of plastic in my hand. It was disguised perfectly as a key fob. I pressed the small on button and saw the tiny red light flicker. I knew that this little device was the perfect tool to start my plan. I knew that David's biggest weaknesses were his massive ego and his endless greed for more money. I needed to create a perfect lure to get him to talk freely. I called a very charismatic friend named Leo, who used to be a very successful sales consultant. Leo was perfect for the job. He was smooth, believable, and excellent at making powerful men feel even more important. I explained the whole awful situation, and Leo was immediately angry and wanted to help me destroy David. I had Leo create a completely fake identity as a high-level executive at a competing firm, a headhunter, offering David a huge, secret, and lucrative consulting gig on the side. Leo called David, flattering him constantly and promising him a massive, secret payout. To make the trap perfect, Leo insisted on meeting David at the expensive, upscale hotel bar David always used to show off his success. David, always arrogant and always blinded by money, fell for the bait instantly. He thought he was about to make an enormous amount of secret money. He quickly agreed to the meeting, eager to discuss the massive, fake fortune Leo promised him. The day of the meeting arrived. I was nervous, but completely determined. I drove to the hotel, wearing a dark wig, large sunglasses, and a hat, hoping to disguise myself completely. I felt like a spy. I sat at a small, dark corner table near the back of the bar, carefully setting the tiny recorder on the table to capture everything. When David walked in, he was loud, flashy, and extremely pleased with himself. Leo was brilliant. He played the part of the admiring headhunter perfectly, constantly buying David expensive scotch. David, fueled by alcohol and his massive ego, started bragging about his complete authority at Crestline Marketing. Leo skillfully steered the conversation, and David admitted to Leo that he had recently fired a difficult female employee who had misunderstood his clear direction. He was twisting the truth, but in his bragging, he admitted to the act of firing me for personal reasons. David took a large, confident gulp of scotch, laughing loudly at his own cleverness. He confessed to Leo, "That girl Audrey? I offered her a golden ticket to the top. She showed me zero respect. She threw the opportunity in my face. I had to make an example of her to show everyone who was in charge." While David was distracted by Leo and the expensive scotch, I put the second part of my plan into action. I knew David sometimes left his work laptop logged into the company network, especially when he was drinking at that bar. I quickly slipped away to the ladies' room, pulled out my old, saved company login details, and used them on my phone. To my surprise and massive luck, my access to the company server still worked. I immediately logged into the Crestline Marketing HR server. I quickly found the completely falsified complaints David had used to fire me. The files were all time-stamped, and I saw clearly that the documents were created after the night I refused his advances on the roof terrace. This was undeniable proof that he had lied and forged the documents after the fact. I downloaded everything. Then I looked deeper. I found expense reports where David had billed the team-building resort weekend, where he cornered me, as a completely separate meeting with a large client. That was clear proof of fraud against his own company. The key files downloaded quickly to my phone. I now had the audio confession and the undeniable proof of his lies, forgery, and company fraud. But as I clicked around in his financial folders, I saw a strange, large, undocumented transfer of funds marked miscellaneous consulting fees, going into an account I had never heard of. I had gathered a strong set of evidence, but I knew that one victim's word, even with a secret recording, could still be explained away by David's high-priced, aggressive lawyers. I needed more. I needed people who had also suffered under his abuse of power. I thought of a former colleague, Chloe. Chloe was a brilliant executive who had left Crestline Marketing 6 months before because David had made her professional life miserable, constantly criticizing her work, stealing her best ideas, and blocking her promotions. I knew she was a quiet victim of his abuse. I found her personal number and called her immediately. She was very hesitant at first, scared of David's power and his reputation in the industry. I completely understood why she was so afraid. I asked her to meet me and played the short audio confession I recorded at the bar. When she heard David's cold, cruel voice admitting his plan, her fear melted away, replaced by a deep, shared anger. Chloe agreed immediately to help me fight him. Chloe looked at me with a mix of shared sadness and focused anger. "You definitely weren't the first, Audrey," she revealed quietly. "There were other bright women David tried to pressure, other talented women he abused and pushed out of the company. I know their names and I know how to find them." Chloe and I began working together in complete secrecy. She was incredibly brave and had a long memory. We quietly reached out to the other women she had mentioned, the ones David had harassed, criticized, and forced to quit over the years. We didn't force anyone to participate, but we shared my story, showed them the recording, and asked if they were finally ready to stand up for themselves. The fear was still there, but the chance to fight back was stronger. We quickly formed a silent, powerful alliance. It was a network of victims who were all ready to expose David's pattern of abuse. The strength of our growing numbers gave everyone the necessary courage. If one person spoke, they could be crushed. But if 5 or 6 people spoke at the same time, David couldn't silence them all. One woman, a former junior executive named Eliza, provided the most crucial piece of evidence yet that proved his behavior. Eliza finally admitted that David had sent her a very suggestive and inappropriate text message late one night during a business trip she was forced to go on. She had bravely saved the text, knowing it was important, but had been too scared to show anyone. She quickly forwarded the text message to me, and it was undeniable, physical proof of his predatory behavior. With the audio confession, the forged documents, the proof of company fraud, and multiple witness statements, I finally felt ready to deliver the final blow. I had all the protection and evidence I needed. The time had come to play my biggest secret. My cousin Sarah, David's wife. I knew that dealing with Sarah would be incredibly painful and delicate. I wasn't just exposing a crime. I was shattering her entire life and marriage. I had to approach her with pure empathy and respect, not with a desire for quick revenge. I got her number from my mother and sent her a short, direct text message. I kept it professional but honest. I simply stated, "Sarah, this is Audrey. We are second cousins. I need to meet you right away about David. It's urgent and concerns his professional integrity at Crestline Marketing." Sarah, clearly surprised and wary by the sudden message from a distant relative she hadn't seen or spoken to in 2 decades, was curious enough to know what was happening. She texted back quickly, "Fine. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. We will meet at the cafe near the park. Neutral ground only. I sat across from Sarah at the park cafe. She was beautiful, but she looked completely exhausted and worried, with a deep line of unhappiness around her eyes. We exchanged short, very awkward greetings, and then I got straight to the point. I didn't want to waste her time, or make her suffer longer. Sarah, I started, keeping my voice very low and steady. We are family, and I have to tell you the painful truth about the man you married. He's been completely lying to both of us for a long time. I didn't lead with my anger about being fired. I led with the terrible fact of his dishonesty. Then I didn't say another single word. I opened my bag, took out the tiny key fob voice recorder, and slid it across the table toward her. It looked completely innocent, like a small, useless piece of plastic. I pressed the play button, and the sound of David's arrogant, bragging voice filled the small space around our table. He was confessing his entire plan to Leo. That girl, Audrey? I offered her a golden ticket. I had to make an example of her. Sarah's hands flew up to her mouth, and her face went completely pale as her husband's cruel, cold confession filled the air. Sarah sat frozen, listening to the entire recording in complete silence. She heard David bragging about destroying my career, admitting that he fired me just because I refused his disgusting advances. After the confession ended, she didn't look at me first. She looked down at the physical evidence. The forged HR documents and the falsified expense reports I had downloaded. The truth of David's systematic lies shattered the entire life she thought she had. I watched as her initial shock quickly turned into a deep, icy, terrifying rage. A cold anger far stronger than my own. She looked up at me, and the years of separation between us instantly vanished. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with a steely, focused resolve. The fight was now completely hers, too. He's been lying about absolutely everything, she whispered, her voice tight with fury. My whole marriage is a complete fraud. Sarah slowly pushed the dossier of documents back toward me, her hands trembling slightly. What's the plan now, Audrey? She asked, her voice hard and clear. He has a board of directors meeting next week. He's asking the board for a massive, unearned bonus. We should give him a completely different kind of surprise. Sarah immediately became the most valuable and strategic ally I could have ever hoped for. She was the ultimate insider, and David still had no idea that his wife was now working completely against him. She still lived in their house, still accessed their shared financial accounts, and still saw his private emails and calendars. She began feeding me huge amounts of critical information. She quickly provided me with his personal calendar, which detailed all his secret client dinners, that were actually meetings with other women. Then she found bank statements that revealed a pattern of secret bank accounts he had opened to hide massive amounts of money. There's much more, Sarah confessed one afternoon, her voice thick with pure disgust. He's not just a sexual predator. He's been embezzling company funds for years, transferring small amounts out to these private accounts that I didn't know about. David's entire life was built on a massive, hidden criminal scheme. Sarah sent me a copy of David's latest financial request to the board, a completely fabricated bonus application based on utterly false performance numbers. He's going to get caught one way or another, she said with determination. Let's make sure it's the most public and spectacular way possible. With Sarah's accurate insider information, the evidence from the other women, and my own initial recordings, the legal case against David became a powerful, unstoppable perfect storm. It was no longer a simple issue of sexual harassment that could be brushed aside. It was a huge case of deep systemic corruption that the company couldn't ignore. We had three main categories of overwhelming evidence. First, sexual harassment, the audio confession and Eliza's suggestive text message. Second, defamation and fraud, the forged HR complaints and the falsified expense reports. And third, embezzlement, Sarah's discovery of the secret accounts and massive undocumented transfers. Chloe and I worked for 2 long days straight, compiling all this evidence into a devastating, professional dossier. It was thick, meticulously organized, and completely damning. We decided to deliver it simultaneously to 2 powerful groups. The board of directors of Crestline Marketing, and the CEO of David's biggest client. We wanted to make sure he was hit from all possible directions at once. The powerful dossier was finally complete, printed and bound. We looked at the clock on the wall. David's huge board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the very next day. The documents were set to be hand-delivered to the board at exactly 8:45 a.m., ensuring maximum shock and impact. The night before the board meeting, I knew David was completely oblivious and smug in his huge house. Sarah reported that he was at home, completely confident, practicing his arrogant speech about why he deserved a massive, $1 million bonus. He was sitting in his office, dreaming of all the secret money he was about to get, not knowing that his entire life was about to be obliterated. Meanwhile, Chloe, Sarah, and I met for a final, quiet dinner. We didn't celebrate prematurely, we just finalized our strategy one last time, making sure every detail was perfect. We reviewed who would talk first, who would present the documents, and what the key facts were. We were calm, focused, and completely ready. It felt like the quiet, intense moments before a major, unavoidable war. I slept deeply that night for the first time in many months. I was no longer afraid of David at all. The next morning, Sarah sent me a short text detailing her final move at the house. David was completely confident, giving her a quick, routine, dismissive kiss goodbye before heading to the office. He was utterly oblivious that his wife had a crisp, black copy of the devastating, life-ending dossier tucked away safely in her expensive leather bag. At exactly 9:30 a.m., just as David was in the middle of his confident presentation to the board of directors, the huge boardroom door opened slowly. David paused, probably expecting a waiter with coffee or his secretary with a note. Instead, I walked in, calm and powerful, followed by Sarah, and then Chloe. The room was full of powerful, older men and women, the leaders of the entire company. David's mouth dropped open in complete shock. His face instantly turned a terrible, burning red. The head of the board, a formidable woman named Mrs. Jennings, looked confused and annoyed by the major interruption. She asked sharply, "Who are you people? You are not authorized to be here in this confidential meeting." I walked calmly to the large, expensive mahogany table, holding the thick dossier tightly in my hands. I looked directly at David, whose eyes were wide with panic, then turned to Mrs. Jennings. My voice was loud and clear, echoing slightly in the shocked room. I replied, "Mrs. Jennings, we're the Accountability Committee." I didn't let David or his expensive lawyer interrupt me this time. I walked confidently to the podium. I didn't yell or cry. Calmly and methodically, just as if I were giving a normal business report, I played the full audio confession for the entire board to hear. David's voice, loud and clear, admitted that he fired me simply for refusing his gross advances. The board members immediately exchanged shocked and furious glances. Then, I displayed the forged HR documents on the huge screen, showing the timestamps that clearly proved they were created after my refusal. I followed that by presenting the financial evidence of his massive embezzlement, pointing out the secret accounts and the huge transfers that Sarah had found. The board was absolutely stunned into silence. There was no way to argue against the mountain of evidence. I finished my powerful presentation and took a step back. The room was deadly silent. Mrs. Jennings, the head of the board, slowly turned her gaze to look at David, whose face was now a terrible, mottled crimson color. Her voice was ice-cold and final. "Mr. Evans," she commanded, "you have exactly 1 minute to explain every single detail of this." David immediately began to splutter and try to lie his way out of the disaster. He was completely unprepared and panicked. He claimed I was a disgruntled ex-employee, trying to completely blackmail him, and that the audio was totally fake. But his ridiculous story immediately fell apart under questioning. He couldn't explain the clear timestamps on the forged documents. He couldn't explain the existence of the secret bank accounts that his wife, Sarah, had found. Every word he spoke only made him look guiltier to the board. The board members were furious. Not just about the harassment, but because he had shamelessly stolen millions of dollars from the company. After less than 60 seconds, Mrs. Jennings cut him off sharply. She picked up her phone and immediately called the company's chief legal officer. Within 5 minutes, the board voted unanimously to terminate David immediately for gross misconduct, and severe financial malfeasance. This meant he was fired for cause, and he would receive no severance package and no huge bonus. David was completely pale and shaking uncontrollably as security guards were called into the room to escort him out of the building. As he passed me on his humiliating walkout, he stopped for a split second. He leaned in and hissed the single defeated word, "You bitch." The news of David's firing for gross misconduct didn't stay quiet for even an hour. The devastating story leaked immediately, spreading like a massive, uncontrollable fire through the entire marketing industry. His once great reputation was completely destroyed overnight. Everyone knew he was a sexual predator and a thief. Headhunters who used to call him every week immediately stopped returning his calls. His professional network, which he had spent years building on lies and fear, completely evaporated into nothing. No one wanted to be associated with a man fired for harassment and embezzlement. His picture and the awful story were everywhere online. Meanwhile, Sarah was moving incredibly fast to cut him out of her life. David came home from his shocking, career-ending board meeting to find that the locks on his huge, expensive house had been completely changed. His security code didn't work anymore. His large, expensive suitcases were sitting neatly on the stone porch, packed with all his clothes and personal items. Sarah had moved him out of the house while he was being fired from his job. Sarah wasted absolutely no time in finishing the complete destruction of David's comfortable old life. She had hired a powerful divorce lawyer, and with the dossier of evidence, the case was simple and quick. She served David with divorce papers the very next morning. She cited his repeated adultery and his severe financial deception as the main reasons. Sarah's lawyer, armed with my complete dossier, ensured that the financial settlement was heavily in her favor. Since David was fired for stealing money, the court had no sympathy for him at all. He was quickly stripped of nearly all his assets. The judge agreed to award Sarah the house, most of the hidden investments, and significant alimony payments from his retirement funds. David, who had lost his six-figure job, his public reputation, and his huge home in less than 48 hours, was left with almost nothing. He was immediately forced to move into a cheap, temporary apartment on the wrong side of town, the total opposite of the luxury life he had built on years of lies. A few weeks later, Mrs. Jennings, the head of the board, called me personally. She was deeply apologetic and remorseful for what I had suffered while working at Crestline Marketing. She told me the company had done a complete, internal review of my original firing, and concluded that David had completely fabricated every charge against me. She offered me more than just my old job back. She offered me David's former, massive position, head of the marketing department. The board was incredibly impressed by my absolute integrity, my courage, and my strategic thinking in gathering all the evidence. They believed I was the only honest person who could truly clean up the massive ethical mess David had made. I paused for a long, careful moment before giving her my answer. This was the promotion and the position I had worked for and deserved, but I was not going to accept it without making some major demands. I smiled into the phone and said, "I appreciate your very generous offer, Mrs. Jennings. I will certainly consider it, but I will only return to Crestline Marketing on my specific terms and conditions." I accepted the huge promotion, but only after Mrs. Jennings fully agreed to every single one of my conditions. I demanded a significantly higher salary, of course, but more importantly, I demanded a complete and total reform of all HR policies to protect all future employees from the kind of gross abuse I suffered. I also demanded the immediate reinstatement of the other women David had wronged and fired. I wanted them to get their jobs and their reputations back, too. On my first day as the new head of the marketing department, I walked into David's old, massive corner office. I didn't feel triumph, but a strong, quiet sense of purpose. I immediately started cleaning house, firing the few people who were still protecting David, and fostering a new culture of respect and clear communication. After a tough but incredibly successful first month in the new, demanding role, I was sitting in my large, beautiful office, reviewing budgets for the next quarter. Suddenly, a new email notification popped up on my computer screen. The sender was an email address I hadn't seen in a very long time, David Evans. I stared at the email from David for a long moment. I almost didn't open it because I knew it would be awful. I finally clicked it open. The email was extremely long, rambling, and full of complete self-pity. David was now completely bankrupt, living in a tiny apartment, and totally unemployable in the marketing industry. He was groveling and begging for any kind of help. He wrote that he had learned his difficult lesson, and that he finally understood the seriousness of his wrong actions. He was pleading for a simple professional reference, or any kind of small, kind word, so he could try to find a low-level job somewhere. He tried to blame his actions on stress and a temporary emotional breakdown. It was pathetic to see him so utterly defeated and trying to completely rewrite history. I finished reading the sad, desperate email. My finger slowly moved across the computer screen, hovering over the delete button. The urge to simply erase him and his pathetic plea from my life was incredibly strong, but a part of me felt that I owed it to myself to face him one last time, in person, to deliver the final word of the judgment. I decided to go ahead and meet David. I told him to meet me at a neutral, very public coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting alone in a corner booth, looking anxious. I barely recognized him. He looked completely broken, a pathetic shell of his former arrogant self. His clothes were worn and wrinkled, and he looked 10 years older than he was. He had dark circles under his eyes. He started pleading and apologizing immediately, his voice low and desperate. He apologized, but his apology sounded shallow and completely empty, like he was only sorry for the huge consequences he suffered, not for the original crime itself. He begged me to help him get a small job at Crestline Marketing, saying he would be loyal and quiet forever. He looked utterly defeated. After a few minutes of his desperate, empty pleading, he looked me dead in the eye, and a strange confusion replaced the desperation on his face. He finally asked the question I knew was burning inside him. Why did you have to destroy me, Audrey? Why did you have to go so far to ruin my life? I didn't rush to answer him. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, gathering all my power and conviction. Then I put my cup down gently and looked him dead in the eye, making sure he couldn't look away from my stare. I didn't destroy you, David, I said, my voice quiet but incredibly firm. You completely destroyed yourself. You built your entire life, your whole career, and your marriage on a rotten foundation of cruel lies and the abuse of your power. I just gave that rotten foundation the slightest, necessary push, and it all collapsed. I saw the full realization hit him. He was the only one to blame for his current situation. I stood up to leave, placing my napkin neatly on the table, indicating the meeting was over. I looked down at him one last time, making sure the difficult lesson sank deep into his mind. All you had to do in your life was be a decent human being, and treat the women who worked for you with professional respect. Remember that, David. Remember that in your next life, because you won't be having a next job in this industry. A full year passed quickly, and my new life as the head of marketing was absolutely incredible. I was thriving as a leader, and my department was consistently exceeding all the financial goals David had always set and missed. My department was completely transformed, and was now the most successful and the most respected department in the entire company. I had become a strong mentor and an inspiration to many other young women in the industry, showing them that integrity and strategic action could win against corruption and abuse. The other women David had wronged were either back at Crestline Marketing or had found better, safer jobs, thanks to our public case. The air in the office was clean, productive, and full of honest opportunity. The legal drama was completely over and long forgotten. One beautiful sunny afternoon, I received a short, happy message on my personal phone. It was from Sarah. She was officially and happily divorced, completely free from his lies, and had used her financial settlement money to start traveling the world, finally seeing all the amazing places she had always dreamed of visiting. My story, though I always kept it officially anonymous, became a powerful legend and an open secret inside the entire industry. Crestline Marketing was now widely known as a company where toxic behavior was quickly punished, and where women were actively protected and respected. I was asked to speak at a major business conference on the important topic of creating ethical and respectful workplaces. I didn't use my name or David's name, but I shared the exact, detailed story of how calculated lies can be quickly defeated by simple truth and irrefutable strategic evidence. My speech was a massive success, immediately empowering a new wave of young women and men to speak out against abusive power structures in their own companies. It was a huge victory that went far beyond just my own career. After I stepped off the stage, feeling completely energized and successful, a young woman approached me. She was trembling slightly, and tears were welling up in her eyes. She grabbed my hand tightly and said quietly, "Your story just gave me the absolute courage I needed to quit my abusive job today. I was dealing with my own David. Now I know I can definitely fight back and win." It has now been 2 full years since I was first fired from my comfortable old life. I was no longer living in my mother's spare room. I had successfully bought my own beautiful, large apartment, just a few blocks from the new, thriving Crestline marketing office. I sat on my own balcony on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, looking out over the city that I had conquered with my integrity. The money, the title, the victory, it was all wonderful and deserved. But the absolute best thing was peace. I was no longer fueled by revenge or anger, but by a powerful, quiet sense of purpose and self-respect. I was a good boss, a fair leader, and a strong, unshakable woman. David and his cruelty were completely irrelevant to my life now. I had used his darkness and his lies to create my own powerful light and new success. I looked out at the busy streets below, realizing that integrity, when paired with strategy, is the most powerful force of all in business and in life. And the best revenge of all? It's living a life so full and happy, you almost forget they ever existed in the first place. If you enjoyed this story, like and comment, and most importantly subscribe to this channel for more.